Wildlife conservation is an issue that concerns everyone. The ecosystems that provide us with clean air, food, and water are reliant on a web of organisms that support one another, and wild animals make up a massive portion of this web. We as humans do a lot to manage wildlife in an effort to hold that balance. For example, we do this by setting limits on hunting. However, poor management decisions in wildlife can have long-lasting ecological consequences. That's why it's crucial that we make sure our decisions are well-informed. A critical first step to effective wildlife management is knowing how many animals are in our population of interest. After all, how can we make decisions on how many deer should be harvested if we don't know how many deer are out there? There are many ways of counting wildlife. However, producing accurate and precise estimates often requires large amounts of funding that small governments and NGOs don't have access to. In my thesis, I'm testing out a new method of estimating wildlife population size called camera trap distance sampling, which offers an accessible, low-cost method for local wildlife research. Wildlife cameras, like the one shown on the right, have revolutionized wildlife research in recent years because of their ability to capture long-term data on multiple species while being cost-effective and non-invasive to the wildlife. Distance sampling is a long-established method of estimating population size that measures the likelihood of detecting a species based on the distance between the animal and the observer. Camera trap distance sampling makes use of this technique by applying the concept to camera trap images, like this one on the left, where we can estimate the distance between the animal, the elk here, and the camera. From this information, we can estimate total detection probability and subsequently population size. Excuse me. My research will be the first to publish, my research is on track to become the first published use of camera trap distance sampling in North America. Using 2 years of camera trap data collected on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, I'll produce estimates of black bear, elk, and deer population size in order to demonstrate the utility of this method in our region. I will also produce an how-to manual for First Nations, local governments, NGOs, and any other group who wants to produce a camera trap distance sampling study of their own. That's it.
The construction industry is a major contributor to resource consumption and carbon emissions, accounting for 20 to 50% of global natural resource use. And the extraction, the processing, and the transportation of the construction material comprise half of buildings' life cycle carbon emissions. And recognizing this challenge, the United Nations has emphasized the importance of sustainable construction practices. In BC, Canada, initiatives such as Energy Step Code, the Embodied Carbon Guidelines for residential building have been introduced to help mitigate the challenge for residential buildings. And one effective strategy is to prioritize locally sourced material for construction use. Since the transportation, especially over long distance, generates large carbon footprint. And this research explored the selection and configurations of the locally sourced low carbon material for key building components, including the roofs, frames, floors, walls, foundations, and insulation. And first of all, the embodied carbon emission of the baseline design are calculated by assessing the greenhouse gas emissions for every material used for building design. And all material used are conventional ones, such as concrete, which have the relatively high embodied carbon emissions. So second, a comprehensive database is developed by gathering data from the literature sources and the local manufacturers, which includes the low-carbon concrete, low-carbon gypsum board, and reclaimed wood, and some other sustainable material. And third, these materials are selectively applied to the building components. 11 scenarios are generated by substituting conventional ones with the low-carbon alternatives. And the result of this case study revealed that 26% reduction can be achieved by this material substitution, which has met the embodied carbon benchmark for residential house in Vancouver. And the finding also emphasized the importance of the early design stage in minimizing carbon emission for residential building. Thank you very much.
Have any of you seen any big cities without a notable water element? Probably not. There could be some small towns along highways or some mining towns near some mines, but thriving urban like centers are always near a prominent water feature like rivers, coastline, like we see, and others. And but oftentimes what ends up happening are these waterfronts, both natural and human-made, end up becoming sites of economic ambitions and less about social gathering and human recreation, which is much needed in urban living environments. So my research is studying public spaces along shorelines, or also called urban blue-green spaces. But let me kind of backtrack a bit. Why do we need to study human use of urban nature? Because there has been growing evidence in the recent times that spending time in nature, interacting with urban nature, be it trees or water elements, restores your attention. There's attention restoration theory from environmental psychology. There is like savanna theory, which like coming from evolutionary biology tells us that spending time in vast grasslands are kind of ingrained in our genes and kind of benefits us. And there's quite well-established literature in green spaces that is already studying the use of humans, how they use it through time and through space within the same park, for example. But I'm focusing on waterside public spaces. And the reason is these public spaces along shorelines are unique than green spaces because they are often geographically predefined. They are not easy to change or create. For example, you could create an urban park by acquiring a patch of land, but it's not so easy to create an ecosystem. So I'm using mobile GPS data to estimate total user volume, and I'm also conducting walking interviews to understand the nuanced experiences of diverse demographic groups, which will help me to understand spatial equity aspects of urban nature use. And with that, I close my nearly 3 minutes presentation. Thank you all for being wonderful listeners.
We were once part of a mighty tree, standing tall, capturing carbon, providing shade, giving life to the forest. But when the loggers came, they took the trunk and left us behind, the branches, twigs, and residues. They call us a slash, and our fate most of the time is to be piled up and set on fire, turning to smoke and ash, never reaching our full potential. Every year in BC alone, tons of a slash are burned, releasing about 5 million tons of CO2 into the air, contributing to air pollution and harming people's health. But this isn't just about pollution. It's a waste of resources and a lost opportunity for the bioeconomy. As a researcher, I heard the slash and made it my mission to help it reach its full potential. Unlocking this potential, however, involves many steps, from collection, transportation, to pre-processing, and final conversion to value-added byproducts, each step associated with high costs. So far, my research has assessed the economic feasibility of several byproduct options, such as bio-oil, biochar, pellets, activated carbon, CNC, and CNF. And building on these insights and using optimization techniques, I'm designing a slash to byproduct supply chain that minimizes the cost while maximizing the use of slash. Think of this optimization as a roadmap that guides important decisions in the slash to byproduct supply chain, like how much a slash should go where, what bioproduction technologies should be established, what byproducts would make the most sense economically and environmentally to be made, and how much of each should be made. But even with an optimized slash supply chain, success isn't guaranteed. Policies play a crucial role in determining what's possible, whether a slash remains just waste or becomes a valuable resource. That's why I'm also studying how different policies, such as the new carbon tax system in BC, incentives, subsidies, and tax-related measures can affect the slash to byproduct supply chain. My work helps policymakers design better incentives, guides investors toward the better opportunities, and gives industries the information and tools they need to make smart decisions. If we get this right, a slash can go from waste to valuable byproducts, driving a future where bioeconomy isn't just an idea, it's the way forward. Thank you.
Imagine a place where the forest is your grocery store, where food isn't simply just bought but shared, and what you eat is a result of the people and the land around you. This is a reality for many indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon. And this is where I did my research. But what happens when this system begins to change? So in my research in Peru, I found that more remote communities had more robust and resilient food systems. These communities had healthier forests that supported more wild animals for them to hunt and wild plants for them to harvest. These communities also relied more on ancestral knowledge to grow a wide variety of food crops. And because of this, they consumed less processed foods and were less impacted by economic shifts like the recent pandemic. In contrast, more urbanized communities have undergone greater amounts of deforestation and land degradation. Therefore, their forests can just no longer sustain the same amount of wild foods. And therefore, these communities rely more on store-bought foods. And these store-bought foods are often highly processed and less nutritious, and also makes them more vulnerable to impacts to food markets. Another important shift that we found is in food sharing networks. So in more remote communities, food sharing networks ensure that everybody eats and reduces the burden of hunting and harvesting per family. In the more urbanized communities, we see that these really important food sharing networks have been lowered and in some cases are just no longer existent. But what is perhaps most striking about all of this is the impact that all of this has had on health. As we can see in the graph above, in the 5 communities that were sampled for anemia and elevated blood glucose, which could be an indicator of diabetes, we see that the more remote communities have fewer cases of both anemia and elevated blood glucose, while the more urbanized communities have increased cases of both of these conditions. So this shows us that these different food systems have a real and notable impact on the health of these communities. So this brings us to an important question. What is meant by having the right to food? As we can see in these cases, it's not just about having enough calories. It's about having access to nutritious and culturally appropriate food that these communities can grow and share in sustainable ways. For indigenous communities in the Amazon, this right to food is linked to the health of their forest. And so when you have forests that are healthier, these communities have more resources, and we can see that their health is better. And when these forests are degraded, these food systems begin to unravel and their health suffers. Thank you.
Are the forests growing today likely to become the forests that we want in the future? Will these forests provide the social, ecological, and economic benefits that we've come to expect? And are current forest management decisions sustainable in the long term? These are the questions that guide forest management in Canada and the forest growth models that are used to assess sustainability, forecast future conditions, and explore alternative management scenarios. Although forest growth models are an integral part of forest management planning in Canada, the operational models that are used to assess sustainability do not consider climate change's impact on growth, meaning that past conditions are assumed to carry forward into an uncertain future. In addition, these models do not consider proactive treatments like adaptive thinning and adaptive planting that could be used to reduce climate stress and encourage tree species that are more suitable in the future. My project seeks to address these issues. To accomplish this, I'm going to use future climate data from the program Climate BC and the Climate Sensitive Forest Growth Model 3PG to project forests into the future. 3PG's process-based structure also allows for the assessment of climate stress based on the functional factors that influence growth, including temperature, precipitation, and soil moisture stress. With this information, we can have a better understanding of forest growth in the future and identify specific locations that are under persistent climate stress, where we might implement treatments that can help forests grow. For example, in the figure above, I have lodgepole pine soil moisture stress through the end of the century under low, medium, and high climate change scenarios. A value of 1 indicates no moisture stress, and a value of 0 indicates extreme moisture stress. Under the high climate change scenario, soil moisture stress increases by 15% by the end of the century, indicating that perhaps in the 2060s, we might want to institute some sort of proactive thinning treatment or transition to a more climate-adapted species like Douglas fir. Currently, I'm working throughout the interior British Columbia to explore these trends. And for the next phase of my research, I will be working with lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, interior spruce, and subalpine fir to deploy this and the proactive treatments I've described at the landscape level to assess sustained yield. Based on this information, I hope that we can make better decisions today that will give us the proactive forest future that we want and need. Thank you very much.
500 years ago, this room and everyone in it might have been underwater. That's because Vancouver and the surrounding area is built upon a floodplain, specifically the floodplain of the Fraser River, one of the biggest rivers in BC. With a large river comes large floods, which can damage human infrastructure, lives, properties, you name it. So to combat this, managers have built a variety of flood control infrastructure throughout the valley to help us humans live here. However, as you might imagine, this infrastructure has some impacts on other species, not just humans. Now, if this room were full of water, there might also be some fish swimming around. Fish like salmon, which are incredibly important in BC for their social, ecological, and economic value. Salmon rely on connectedness of floodplain habitats to finish their life cycle. And flood control infrastructure can be a significant barrier to this life cycle, adding more threats to fish that are already struggling to keep up with this changing climate. One way that managers are working to make flood control infrastructure better for salmon is through the creation of fish-friendly flood pumps. A flood pump is a device that moves water over a dike. Think of the main stem of the river. A dike is built to keep it from flooding, keep it from overtopping the banks. However, a river isn't as simple as just a main channel. There's streams, creeks, and sloughs that come off of it. So flood pumps work to connect these off channels with the main stem of the river. However, although upgrading a flood station to a fish-friendly flood pump is a great idea, fish-friendly flood pumps are largely a manufacturing term, and the actual impact of these structures on salmon has not been largely studied. That's where my research comes in. I'm working to understand how these fish-friendly flood pumps actually impact the experience of juvenile salmon as they move through the pumps, hopefully identifying areas of injury and mortality. To do this, I'm using a device called a sensor fish, a small device that as it moves through the pump structure, collects data on acceleration, pressure, and rotation. I can pair this data with real-life experiences of fish going through the pump to understand where areas of impact might be occurring that could kill the fish. It's still early, but so far, the data are showing that fish-friendly flood pumps do impact fish passage and could cause injury and mortality. With my data, I'd like to identify what aspects of these flood pump stations are the most harmful to salmon and work to understand how they're impacting their survival, both immediately through the flood pump and further down the line in the river. Hopefully, I will work to create a best practices document for managers when upgrading flood pump stations. This will allow them to upgrade the stations with keeping in mind the actual experience of the fish and noting infrastructure that could cause harm to fish. This will allow managers to upgrade infrastructure to actually be friendly for fish, not just in name, but in actual experience of the fish. Thank you.
Fisheries work is often thought of as a field dominated by men. But the reality is 50% of the global fisheries workforce are women. Fisheries science and management often overlooks the roles women occupy in post-harvest as vendors and processors, instead focusing its efforts on harvesting activities, the section of fisheries dominated by men. So what happens when we leave women out? Well, their labor gets undervalued, struggles they face in their daily jobs, like gender-based violence, goes on unaddressed, and fisheries management is less robust. And while work is being done to address these inequalities, where it's happening around the world is not equal. Gender in fisheries research is often focused in Asia and Africa, leaving many unanswered questions about the experiences of women in the fisheries of Latin America. So I spent my last summer in Guyana, a country on Latin America's North Atlantic coast, to address this missing information. I lived along the Berbice River with a fishing family, and I worked in fish markets interviewing women to learn about the struggles they face at work and how they envision a more promising future. In Guyana, while some women do fish, most work in post-harvest as processors and vendors. Although they have practiced the trade their whole lives, the fishing industry they've always known is changing dramatically. The discovery of offshore oil in Guyana's waters, coupled with climate change impacts, is lowering fish populations and raising the price of fish. When I spoke with vendors, they told me that they feel these impacts as they see fewer customers on the day-to-day, meaning that they have to spend more on fish storage, even wasting their income because they have to throw fish out at the end of the day. With the challenges that these changes are bringing, vendors told me that the fish vending is becoming a dying business. And seeing the day-to-day struggles of these women, it became even more disappointing to know that Guyana's fishery management agency funnels all of its budget into harvesting activities, the male-dominated sector of its fisheries. And despite these hardships that come with this, women are working to cope with these challenges by diversifying their livelihoods and leaning on community networks. So unfortunately, this exclusion shows that like women in other regions of the world, their livelihoods and the importance of them have been made invisible. Now, what we can learn from these Guyanese women is that although they are resilient, they should not have to cope without support. Neglecting their livelihoods puts these women and Guyanese people's access to fresh and nutritious seafood at risk. With the precarious state that fisheries are in, both in Guyana and globally, fisheries management agencies cannot afford to exclude the critical voices and needs of the women working tirelessly to feed their communities. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Ming Hui. So in my free time, I like to go to the mini forest and ponder the essence of everything, like where we are from and why things function in a certain way. So we know that DNA determines everything, but actually it's a sequence of its 4 building blocks that determines life, right? Protein, the major component of our human body, again, it's the order of its 20 types of amino acid building blocks that determines the function of protein. So with DNA and protein, carbohydrate can be produced. Carbohydrates, the most dominant biomolecule on Earth, not just the food we eat, but also the major component of trees and plants. So, like DNA and protein, the sequence of its specific sugar units for plant carbohydrates carries crucial information. So look at this very simple 2 carbohydrate chains I made with Lego. Can you see the difference? It's clear, right, that the blue set sugars are arranged differently. Now, this tiny change means everything. It directly influences its structure, its function, it changes everything. However, until now, we know almost nothing about the specific sugar sequencing for carbohydrates. Why? Because it's too complex and diverse, yeah. So our team is tackling this challenge with 2 superpowers, gene editing and AI. Here's what we do. We added the genes that control the synthesis of carbohydrates in plants. And this allows us to have carbohydrates with the same main chain at different side chains. We then break them down with enzymes and analyze the fragments. And this whole process will generate a massive amount of data. And then we turn to our Superman AI. It helps us analyze the data and reconstruct the most likely sugar sequence. So we're working on this. Imagine more researchers join us. We get to build the first plant carbohydrate database, just what we have for DNA and protein. Now, this would be super powerful in unraveling the plant mysteries like the evolutionary pattern and the biological mechanisms in plants. It will help us conserve and engineer more resilient trees in a changing climate. And very importantly, it will revolutionize the way we design growing materials. So, this will bring us closer to a more sustainable future. So let's look forward to that day together. Thank you.
Imagine looking at the forest after a fire. A forester might be interested in plant regeneration, while an ecologist might be interested in mapping out the caribou habitat. Either way, one of the first questions they will ask is how the fire will change the forest stands. In Canada, we have a forest stand inventory system which consists of a set of polygons to represent forest stands. So after a major disturbance such as fire, governments will send out crews to the area and then try to redraw the polygons to replace the existing ones when they are impacted by fire. This process usually takes 5 to 10 years and it costs lots of money. In my research, we are developing an automatic forest stand segmentation algorithm to update this set of forest polygons over time. So we are utilizing the remote sensing satellite imagery, such as the Landsat program, as you can see from the left of the slide. So Landsat provides nearly 4 decades of imagery for us to see the spectral information of our forest. So now we're going to talk about the method. In the method, we have 2 stages. In the first stage, we will use the Landsat scene to group similar pixels together to form micro-stands. And then in the second stage, we will further merge these micro-stands with their neighboring stands using the forest attributes available to us every year. So our algorithm is very efficient because it only looks at change area where land cover changes, for example, from shrubs to conifer. So let's talk about the results a little bit. On the top row of my slide shows the time series of forest polygons generated by my algorithms. As you can see, the green polygons are the forest polygons, and the gray areas shows the non-forested areas. So when the fire happened in 1992, you can see the orange forest segments got smaller because they impacted by fire. And as time progresses, when the shrub on the bottom row in yellow got replaced by conifer, these orange segments expanded and become bigger. So our algorithm is able to provide this temporally consistent forest inventory, and hopefully we can apply this across the entire Canada of 650 million hectares of forested stands. So thank you very much.
I want you to imagine going for a walk in the rain. Not so hard when you live here in Vancouver. Now imagine that it's raining and you go inside a forest. Suddenly, the rain is a lot less intense. The water is getting intercepted. Some of it might be falling around you and the ground is still wet. The water that's getting intercepted is evaporating back into the atmosphere. It's dripping down a tree stem or it's falling through to the forest floor. This interaction between precipitation and vegetation is greatly important for our water cycles and water availability. In snow-dominated regions, like in the southwestern interior of British Columbia, vegetation impacts snow melt and snow accumulation. These drive flooding events in the early spring after large melt events, as well as water availability in the late summer when precipitation is low. When a disturbance occurs, like wildfires, pest outbreaks, or human activity, this change in the forest composition can alter the way that water moves through a watershed. So for land managers, it's important to understand when a disturbance occurs, one, how forests recover, and two, how hydrological systems adapt to the changing vegetation. But how do we know when a forest has truly recovered? Not just by how it looks, but by how it behaves within a larger ecological system. To think about this, we often use the idea of hydrological recovery. We say that a stand has recovered hydrologically when its hydrological conditions return to their pre-disturbance characteristics. However, current models are limited in their ability to model hydrological recovery because of limitations in two key factors: the rate and behavior of vegetation regrowth. So my research looks to fill this gap by using satellite imagery and LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, to map vegetation regrowth through time using a key ecological indicator called Leaf Area Index, or LAI. LAI is the leaf area per unit of ground area. So if I was standing in a forest and there was a tree above me, the leaf area index would be the number of leaves above me in a vertical column. LiDAR provides us with fine-scale 3D structural information like LAI, and satellite imagery provides us with continuous monitoring of LAI through time. I harness these data sets together and use this to inform a hydrological model. I then simulate different disturbance scenarios to better understand how specific changes in vegetation alter hydrological processes. With this and more accurate models, we can better understand how human activities and climate change alter hydrological systems, and we can inform critical management decisions for harvesting and natural disaster resiliency. Thank you.
Picture this. It's a cold winter night in Alberta's boreal forests. The air is crisp, the trees tower overhead, and the ground is covered in snow. And somewhere in the shadows, a massive creature, standing over 2 meters tall with antlers as big as an adult male, moves silently through the trees. This is the moose, a symbol of Canada's wilderness. But these majestic creatures are more than just cultural icons. They're vital to the health of boreal ecosystems and the traditions of Indigenous communities. But now they're under threat. Across the province of Alberta, local moose populations are declining. Climate change and forestry activities are altering their habitat, diseases spreading, while predators push them into human settlements, leading to increased conflict. But to protect and manage their populations, we need to first understand where they are and how many there are. Because if we can't count them, we can't save them. But how do we accurately and monitor moose? But there's a problem. Counting moose is harder than it sounds. Traditionally, wildlife managers relied on hunting estimates and helicopters to survey the moose from the air, searching for their dark shapes against the snow. But this method is expensive, it's risky, and highly stressful for these animals. Also, it's limited, because moose often hide under dense trees and are active at night when they can't be seen by helicopters. So how do we accurately and efficiently monitor moose? This is where my research comes in. I'm developing an intelligent system to monitor and detect moose using thermal drone imagery. Drones equipped with thermal cameras can accurately detect and count moose by detecting the warm body temperatures of moose against the cold environment, even at night or under dense tree cover. They're also safer, they're cheaper, and more effective than helicopters. But there's still another problem. Drones can capture thousands of imagery per flight, and manually reviewing those images will take days to weeks and are biased and are prone to human error. This is where deep learning comes in. By training computer vision models to accurately detect and count moose in thermal drone imagery, we can provide faster, more accurate, and unbiased moose estimates. Ultimately, this system will allow us to monitor moose in ways we never could before, leading to better, effective measures of where exactly they are and how many, where they're declining and how they're shifting, leading to better conservation measures. Also, this system can be applied to other species in the world, including polar bears, koalas, and other endangered animals. So the next time you spot a moose in the wild, remember, that might just be one of the moose that a thermal drone has detected.
In November 2021, large floods swept away roads, bridges, and railroads here in southwestern BC, cutting Vancouver off from the rest of the country. This halted transportation, damaged properties and agriculture, killed 1.3 million animals, and cost us $14 billion in damages. Yet, this is just one out of many recent flood events in BC, sparking lawsuits on who is to blame and leaving many asking how we can better protect ourselves in the future. But all of this revolves around answering one key question. Are large floods like this becoming more common from human activities? This is what I'm studying. So I looked at lots of flooding and climate studies to see how we can best characterize these changing risks. Then putting my insights together, my work suggests that we can best guide our investigations by asking questions like, are human activities making floods bigger? But more importantly, are they making them become more common? So nature has lots of recipes to create floods. She mixes ingredients like the amount of rainfall, snowfall, amount of energy to melt the snow, and how wet our soils are. And she mixes them in random ways to create small, medium, or large floods. But where do humans come into this? Well, we change up nature's recipes. For example, by removing forests, we pile up more snow on the ground, and we melt it faster. So by having more of these ingredients, we're getting more and more recipes leading to larger and larger floods. Now, while it's important to ask if floods becoming bigger are important, what might surprise us more is if we ask how often or frequently they're happening. Let's say I said that large flood sizes are increasing by 10%. You might ask, well, what does that mean? But if I told you that large floods that happened once in around 50 years before are now happening once in around 5 years because of what we're doing, then that might be really important for you to know, especially if you're living in an affected area. In fact, my work suggests that these really large increases in frequencies are happening because floods are just really sensitive to what we humans do to the earth. So by looking at the sensitivity, we can use this knowledge to motivate strong policies and enact smart solutions. Thank you.
Broadly distributed species need to be able to live in a wide variety of environmental conditions. This variation across their environment is one of the main drivers of genetic and phenotypic diversity within species. One of the ways we test for this diversity is using common garden experiments, where seeds from populations across a species range are grown at a variety of sites across the range. This establishes a transfer distance, which isn't a geographic distance, but rather the difference in the environment from a species' home site to the site where it's being planted. By testing species across a range of transfer distances, we can determine how sensitive they are to changes in their growing environment, or how locally adapted they are to their home environment. In my master's project, I will be collating data for common garden experiments from 18 different tree species across over 1,700 different populations, with the goal of examining the patterns of local adaptation, both across species and across space. Because they give us information about how species respond to changes in the environment, common garden experiments are a valuable resource for predicting what climate change impacts are going to be on our forests. Local adaptation can be an important indicator of how vulnerable a population is to increases in the rate of environmental change. Are there certain species that are going to be more vulnerable, or are there areas where all species are equally at risk for climate change impacts? I'm also interested in examining the conditions that lead to the evolution of local adaptation. In this hypothetical example, let's compare population 1 and population 2. Both of these populations are exchanging seeds, pollen, and genes with populations surrounding them. Our population 2, where the environment is quite homogeneous, is mostly exchanging genes with populations experiencing very similar conditions to its home environment. Whereas population 1, where the environment is quite variable, is exchanging genes with populations that are adapted to highly variable conditions, very different conditions. Theory predicts that this will lead to populations in heterogeneous environments being less locally adapted, as they are constantly being swamped with genes which, while helpful in their home environment, are actually disadvantageous in the population that they're moving into. By comparing patterns of local adaptation across the continent, I'm going to be able to test if we see this theory in empirical data. The goal of my research is hopefully to both expand our understanding of how local adaptation evolves and to make practical insights about what that will mean for our forests under climate change. Thank you.
What if I told you that the biggest wildfire is already waiting to happen next summer? The fuel is there, dry forest, rising temperature, and a strong wind. The only thing is missing, a single spark. Now imagine you waking up to a world where the sky is not blue, but orange. The air is thick with smoke, and every breath is a reminder that the nature is burning. Communities evacuate, firefighters battle impossible, and forests, which takes decades in making, are vanishing in hours. These are not the scene from Hollywood movie. This is the reality of the British Columbia every summer. We often think of wildfire as an unpredictable force of nature. But what if they weren't? What if we could predict them before they start? What if we could forecast the damage, protect resources, and plan for a future? That's exactly my research aims to do. In the first phase, I'm going to predict the wildfire intensity and total burn area in BC using machine learning models. This has helped us to anticipate the disasters and take proactive measures before they escalate. But wildfires don't just destroy forests. They also create new opportunities. After a fire, burned harvesting residues known as a slash become available. So instead of letting them go into waste, we can transform them into bioenergy and value-added products such as biochar, bio-oil, CNC, and CNF, to reducing the dependency on fossil fuels. By seizing this opportunity, we can turn loss into innovation. So in the second phase, I'm going to predict the biomass availability over the next decades, incorporating the wildfire uncertainty from the previous phase using machine learning models. This is critical for ensuring forest sustainability and resource planning. But predicting biomass isn't enough. We need a strategy to use it wisely. That's where exactly the third phase of my research comes in. Even if we have biomass, producing bioproducts comes with major challenges: high transportation costs, expensive facility installation, and significant greenhouse gas emissions. That's why I developed a mathematical optimization model
that design the most efficient biomass supply chain. The model determines which byproducts to produce, where to build facilities, and how to minimize the cost and environmental impacts. By combining AI and optimization, my research doesn't just predict the wildfires. It helps us to plan for a future. Because when it comes to the battle against wildfires, every second and every decision counts.
In 2003, the Human Genome Project published its final draft of the human genome, the representation of all of our genetic information, our DNA. This massive achievement cost us around $2.7 billion, okay, a pretty hefty price tag. Today, it actually costs less than $1,000 to sequence a human genome. This drastic reduction in costs reflects how much more powerful and efficient sequencing technology has become. So now we're in an era where we're building genomes for thousands of species that we really care about, and we're using them to understand these species better. One species we really care about here in British Columbia is Douglas fir. This conifer is foundational to our timber industry, our ecosystems, and our cultural idea of BC landscapes. All of the trees in this photo here are Douglas fir, which might surprise you because they kind of look pretty different, right? On one side, the trees are really tall and dense, and on the other side, they're a lot shorter and more sparse. This is because Douglas fir actually has two varieties. The coastal variety, found here in the Pacific Northwest, that's the taller one, and the interior or Rocky Mountain variety, that's the shorter one. In my research, I'm interested in understanding this dichotomy from the perspective of the genome. To do this, I'm taking genomes that we've built for the interior and coastal Douglas fir, and I'm lining them up like you can see here, and I'm comparing them. I'm interested in pulling out any differences in the actual structure or architecture of these genomes. I'm hoping to understand if these variations have any impact on adaptation. We know that the interior Douglas fir is more adapted to certain types of climate stress than the coastal variety. This makes sense, right, intuitively. In the coastal environment, the Pacific Northwest rainforest, it's a very temperate and productive environment, in contrast to the interior, where the climate is a lot harsher and drier and seasons are more extreme. I'm hopeful that understanding where these genomic variations can be found will help inform breeding decisions to help build more climate-resilient populations into the future. More broadly, my work aims to understand what the role of genomic diversity is in species diversity. This is an important question in an era of intense anthropogenic change and climate change. Thank you.
You see this, a little kid, he's playing with a logging truck. He was so excited to open up this toy. There's logs in it, a set number. He's in his backyard playing with it. He knows exactly what this operational environment looks like. It's nice and easy, nice and simple. Okay, now let's think about forest operations and operational planning in general, forest management. Our operating environment is much bigger than a little kid playing in his backyard with a log truck. It spans spatial and temporal scales, ranging from the entire landscape to those little tiny polygons or blocks, which are where we harvest. And this is all part of forest management planning. On one end, we have strategic forest management planning. Those are our big picture decisions, long-term sustainability, looking at social, environmental, and economic objectives like timber supply, carbon sequestration, and the protection of biodiversity along the landscape. But on a much smaller scale, we have those nitty-gritty operational details. When and where to harvest, what equipment to move where, what logs to put on trucks. Now, the current standard for forest operational planning is a little bit limited. Obviously, it's very site-specific. You have very clear blocks and polygons in these different forests, but this site specificity makes it difficult to propose a generalized formulation. It also begs questions about transparency, accountability, and equitable access when so many of these great models that tackle the forest operational planning problem that have been tackled for decades are behind paywall barriers or proprietary contracts. After all, companies are using them to improve their operations. But is it even possible to propose a generalized formulation? That's where my thesis comes in. I'm proposing a novel, open source, generalized formulation of the forest operational planning problem and hoping to validate it across a series of operating environments within British Columbia using operations research methods and testing this data based on our current level of data with VRI. I want to help an operational forester make the best decision possible and allow them to make that decision about their forest operational planning with the level of confidence as this little kid who's in their backyard knowing exactly what their data is. Allowing them to test and run scenarios that have never been tested before, improving their confidence so that they can make their decision making for the landscape the best that it can be. Thank you.